Did you know that St. John's, Newfoundland burned down? The whole city burned to the ground. Well, about 80 or 85% of the town anyway, gone, up in smoke. All that was left was a forest of chimneys. And did you know that this happened like a bunch of times? The way the streets are today, the buildings we see, the style of the architecture of Old St. John's, it's all shaped by fire. We think of St. John's as a very old city by North American standards, and it is, but we don't have a lot of surviving proof to attest to this fact. You can see a lot of the old buildings around that have date plaques showing years in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but that's not really impressive. Most major cities around North America can claim a history at least that long. The reason for this is the last big fire. It's not the first fire in St. John's that was called the Great Fire, but the Great Fire of 1892 was kind of the starting point of the city as we know it today. The Great Fire of 1892 wiped the city out, but the city that was wiped out rose from the ash of another conflagration 46 years and 1 month exactly earlier. And the 1846 version of the city was rebuilt on the ruins of a city that burned a few times, most notably twice in November 1817, but then promptly again as the city was still recovering in 1818 and then again in 1819. The city of St. John's was very, very different in 1819. It was much smaller, of course, but the small area around the harbor was pretty densely populated. The version of the city in 1846 was very different from the one that burned down nearly 30 years before, and the same can be said for the 1892 version of the city, but each iteration of the town packed people closely together around the harbor. If we're going to try and picture what St. John's looked like as it was burning, I think it's pretty important to contextualize this a little bit. So now, I'm no spring chicken. I'm old enough that my eyes are starting to go a little bit. Like just 2 years ago, I could read the small print on a bottle of Advil, but I saw an optometrist for the first time in my life this past August, and I got a prescription for reading glasses because, as she said, my nearsighted vision was deteriorating. But she also said, that's nothing to worry about, it's just something that happens to people my age. My point is, in my own life, I've seen St. John's change and grow in substantial ways. Like, I remember driving through the city to get to the airport from Mount Pearl because there was no Team Guju Highway or even Outer Ring Road. I remember watching the Baby Leafs and the semi-pro senior hockey league actually before that, down at that fancy old Dominion at the head of Kitty Vitty Lake before Mile 1 was built. I even remember the traffic cop that used to halt us and wave us through the intersection at Prescott and Duckworth. And all that's nothing. I know some of you watching this right now might be able to tell me things you remember vividly that were gone long before my time even. And why is this important? It's important to help us understand the context, to help envision how different St. John's was in 1892, 1846, 1817. If you're old enough to remember a time before Churchill Park was built, and I know for a fact that there are at least a few of you, my regular viewers, who are members of this cohort. First of all, thank you for watching. It's an honor to have you here. But secondly, you're going to be amongst a group of people who will remember that St. John's, even in the days that my parents know, hardly extended out past the downtown core. Where it did extend beyond this area felt like being out in the country, to my understanding. That's why the merchants and lawyers built and lived on the outskirts of town, out around Circular Road and Rennie's River. That's why the Pen was built way out on the banks of Kitty Vitty Lake. The Pen wasn't built in homage to Victorian-era dungeons. It was, and is, a Victorian-era dungeon. But I digress. There isn't much in the way of built structures remaining today to delineate the boundaries of the 1817 and 1846 fires, but there are a handful of buildings still standing that would have felt the heat of those flames. The survivors of the 1892 blaze are interesting though. They demarcate boundaries of the fire, but more than that, they offer intrigue by way of a small handful of buildings that actually lay in the wake of the flames but somehow survived. I say somehow because there are tales of residents banding together, battling against the odds to save, for example, Doctors Row on Duckworth Street's East End. But there are other examples, such as the Union Bank building further west on Duckworth, that survived seemingly on luck alone. When the city burned down all those times in the 19th century, it isn't an exaggeration to say exactly that. The city burned down. The whole thing gone. Lessons were not really learned fire by fire. Some of this was out of stubbornness and hubris, but some of it was born from necessity. When the city burned in the bitter cold November of 1817, it was quickly built back up with wood and whatever other materials were on hand, simply to keep people from freezing to death. Road planning, and specifically widening, was needed but overlooked. The excuse of emergency shelter to escape unusually cold November temperatures wasn't afforded to the city rebuilders in June of 1946, but the same materials were used and the same narrow streets were essentially kept. So I'm not sure what the excuse that time was. It wasn't until the last catastrophe of the 1800s that thoughtful planning won the day and guided the rebuilding efforts. What we have today isn't perfect, but we haven't had a conflagration like that since. There is still and will always be a possibility of disaster with the wooden row houses lining Old St. John's, and there was a genuine scare of a new calamity on a freezing cold night in December of 1992 that I remember myself, with a huge chunk of Harvey Road going up in flames. This blaze was thankfully brought under control, but not before many buildings were destroyed. Fire response is modern today, and the likelihood of total destruction is low, but that's what the people of St. John's thought early in the day on July 8th, 1892. It wasn't just St. John's that changed a lot since the Great Fire. The world has changed. The construction of the Eiffel Tower was completed in 1889. Carl Benz is largely credited with rolling out the first modern, practical, gas-powered automobile in 1886. The Brooklyn Bridge was completed and opened to the public in 1883. The Boston subway was open in 1897. There was a lot going on in the world. And St. John's was definitely not the only city in North America that fell victim to a great fire in the 19th century. Now, I'm no expert in other cities, but I know that at least there were the great fires of Chicago in 1871, where 300 people lost their lives. Boston, 1872, and 30 people were killed. Quebec City, I think, had at least 2 fires, one in 1845 and maybe 1866, if I remember. Montreal caught fire in 1852, with nearly a quarter of the city's population left homeless in that one. And then St. John, New Brunswick in 1877, with nearly half of that city's population homeless. The history of St. John's, in general, is fascinating to me. The stories of the great fires loom large in my mind. How the city has literally been shaped by fire, how it has risen from the ashes time after time. It's amazing. Things don't just fall into place in a city. Well, few do anyway. In a city like St. John's, there's a lot of chaos where in most other cities there would have been some semblance of order. Sometimes this is because of utter nonsense, but sometimes it becomes apparent that some of this was never meant to be chaos for chaos's sake. Sometimes things happen for a reason. Sometimes the reason is weird, but it is a reason. And even when that reason is impossible to ascertain, 130, 170, 200 years on, it's impossible to ascertain because any records were lost to the flames.